Hey guys, it's Abdul for the good folks over at Leon Tailoring, 809 North Delaware, downtown Indianapolis. Now, just because it's tailor-made clothing does not mean it is out of your price range. You walk into Leon Tailoring, you'll see a great wide selection of clothes that are actually quite reasonable and quite affordable and very comparable to what you pay at the big box stores. It's just the fact that it's just better clothes that last longer. So don't let the tailoring part fool you. Swing on by Leon Tailoring and see what I'm talking about. Leon Tailoring, 809 North Delaware and downtown Indianapolis. That's Leon Tailoring, 809 North Delaware and downtown Indianapolis. Well, folks, we have a story about an administration that's under scandal right now, a staff person or two who may have done things out of control. But no, we're not talking about the Hogshead administration. We're actually talking about Watergate, because this month actually marks the 50th anniversary of Richard Nixon stepping down as president because of the Watergate scandal. Ehrlichman, Haldeman, John Dean, all those folks, and a guy named Bill Ruckelshaus is also in the middle of all that, who oddly enough has an Indiana connection because his nephew John Ruckelshaus is a state senator here in the Indianapolis area. So, John, my friend, how's it going?
Abdul, it's great. It's I don't know how to respond that you thought about the mayor scandal. You immediately thought about me. So I don't know whether to appreciate that or run for the door.
No, talk about your uncle. So there we go. So first of all, how you been? How's everything going?
Everything's great. We are actually working now in the healthcare space, and that's been very, very rewarding in that regard. And I have my son. You know about my son, who's a quadriplegic son. He's now in a startup business. He's back with us, and our oldest son is getting married next year. So now we're helping the economy out quite a bit.
Oh, gosh. Well, let's go back to that time. Back in the early 70s, late 68, Richard Nixon runs for president, wins, in part because of George Wallace on the ticket, runs again in 72. And then for some strange reason, things kind of fall off the rails. What was it like back then?
Oh, it was crazy. Now, when I say crazy, it was a very different time. Now, think about this. Actually, there was some analogy that was going on just recently, right? Because you had a skirmish, a war that was going on in Vietnam. Look what's going on in Ukraine and Israel. You had inflation that was running out of control. You had interest rates that were sky high. You had economy that was in tatters, if you will. And you had Nixon, who was really consumed with all these issues, as well as he was a pretty innovative president. He was the first one to go to China. He created the Environmental Protection Agency, of which my uncle, Bill Ruckelshaus, will talk about that, was the first administrator in 1969. So it was a very interesting period with a lot of analogy to today.
And also remind people that Richard Nixon also, once he started affirmative action, it was called the Philadelphia experiment at the time. If my memory serves me correctly. So for all these people who go on about, DEI being some big liberal thing or affirmative action being liberal, actually, no, it's actually kind of started by Republicans. I'm just throwing that out there.
Well, that's exactly right. And again, back to the environment. A lot of people look back to today when we have the climate change issue that's going on, and some Republicans or some that don't want to think that it's real. Back in the day, I remember talking to my uncle Bill Ruckelshaus quite a bit about this. It was very real back then because literally you had our cities were shrouded in fog when you'd wake up in the morning from all the smog that was going on from cars that didn't have any catalytic converters, no kind of pollution control in it at all. And literally our rivers were on fire. So this was very much, the environment was very much atop of the national consciousness at that point.
Now, how did your Uncle Bill end up in the Nixon administration?
Really interesting story. So this all started basically, Bill ran in 1966 for the Indiana House of Representatives and won, representing the north side. That's when basically you elected the top 15 vote getters on the north side of Indianapolis, whether it be Republicans or Democrats. That's how you voted, the top 15. So Bill won that. That was a huge Republican year in 1966. So as a freshman in the Indiana House of Representatives, he was elected majority leader. First time that's ever happened, and probably the last time that's ever going to happen in Indiana state politics. So here he was that. He did a great job in the Indiana House. And then the Republican Party came to him, they being L. Keith Buellen. And Abdul, this is very important. So this is back in a time when political parties were very powerful. You didn't have the primary system. You had a slating system in Marion County. You then had, I know you guys have talked about on some of your podcasts about having conventions select the United States senators. That's what they did back at conventions. Parties were very powerful back then. Keith Buellen being the Marion County Republican chairman, who also had a close relationship with Richard Nixon and his team, selected Bill to run for the United States Senate. So in 1968, after serving one term in the Indiana House of Representatives, Bill then ran for the United States Senate to represent Indiana against then Birch Bayh, Evan Bayy's father. Very popular as a Democrat here in the state of Indiana. As a matter of fact, Bill's first poll that he took in the spring of 1968 was Birch Bayh 68, Bill Ruckelshaus 13. His pollster looked at him and said, "Is it too late to get out?" So, no, he didn't. He hung in there and he ran, and he only lost by 5 points. Well, that got nationally the attention of a lot of Republicans and Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon then was, during the campaign, again, talking, as we talked earlier, that the environment was a major issue back then, probably one of the top 3 issues. Richard Nixon, a Republican, decided to create the first Environmental Protection Agency, an agency of government to help be steward of our environment. So he tabbed Bill Ruckelshaus to be the first EPA director. So that's how it started, the Nixon administration.
Our guest on the program today is our good friend, Republican State Senator John Ruckelshaus, who is the nephew of Bill Ruckelshaus. So, Bill, what does that matter? This month marks the 50th anniversary of Richard Nixon stepping down from the Watergate scandal. So we figured, hey, a little bit of history lesson and sort of Indiana's connection to that. Now, let me ask you this. When Bill took over the EPA, when did he leave the EPA?
So he was at the EPA from, it would have been, he would have been confirmed in probably February or March of 1969. And I believe he left in about 1971 because from there he became director of the FBI for about 6 months and then moved on to assistant U.S. Attorney General. And that started moving into the Watergate chapter.
Now, who did he take over the FBI from, J. Edgar Hoover, or?
There was, I apologize, I can't remember off the top of my head who that was, but there was, J. Edgar Hoover had passed away about that time frame, about 6-8 months prior.
Which I'm sure was a major shock to the country. He'd been FBI director since like the 1930s.
And took all the secrets to the grave of everybody in government.
And had tapes on Martin Luther King and JFK. I long for the days when the only scandal was that you're cheating on your wife.
Well, those were alive and well. That was chump change back then, of course, what J. Edgar Hoover had on everybody. And that was his shtick, if you will. So he had passed away. There was another interim director of the FBI. But Bill, being a super lawyer that he was, Richard Nixon and his administration then tapped him to be the director of the FBI. So he did that for about 6 months until that opening came as Assistant U.S. Attorney General.
Now, how did all that come down?
So that came down when Elliot Richardson, who was then appointed and nominated and confirmed by the U.S. Senate to be Attorney General, and then my uncle then went through the confirmation process as well because he was nominated by Richard Nixon to be Deputy or Assistant U.S. Attorney General, which was number 2. Both of those ran the Justice Department at the tail end, now that we find out, or the beginning of the Watergate saga.
Now, what type of things did he do at the U.S. Attorney's office? Was he like, hey, run the day-to-day operations, go after a hippie with a marijuana cigarette? I mean,
well, he didn't know you, Abdul, at that point, but no, I'm just joking, of course. But the important thing, I think what Bill did during that time period was fast forward, he was really good about going after such things as organized crime. So, for example, fast forward, after all this was done and Watergate was all over with, Bill was also chairman of the board of Browning Ferris Incorporated. And this was back in the 1980s, early 1990s. So his penchant then was really organization. Bill was a phenomenal leader from a corporate standpoint, number one. So, yes, he ran the day-to-day, if you will. And Elliot Richardson then was responsible for more of the ideology, if you will, of things that they looked at the Department of Justice. But back what Bill did when he was at BFI, he went after organized crime, and in particular, the trash business. BFI is in the trash business. Organized crime used that in New York City as their vehicle. That's how they infiltrated and ran New York City. That was the legitimate business. So Bill did a lot of those kinds of things at the Department of Justice.
Our guest on the program today is John Ruckelshaus. John is the nephew of Bill Ruckelshaus, who was one of the folks involved in the Watergate scandal 50 years ago, which we're talking about on the program today. So let's fast forward. We've laid the groundwork for who Bill Ruckelshaus was and what he did. How did he end up being attached to the Watergate deal?
Oh, very interesting. So as we all know from our history books, and now there's some good documentaries on, I believe, Netflix and some things like that you could watch, and great books. There's just volumes after volumes of books that have been written from a historical standpoint. Obviously, Richard Nixon was a very paranoid individual. A really good example of this was when Bill was director of the FBI, he went in to talk to Richard Nixon, and he was going in to talk to him about a specific issue. And this was a day that Richard Nixon had ordered the bombing on Hanoi. And he was trying to, remember, when he ran for election, he being Richard Nixon, he promised to get us out of Vietnam. But
he had a secret plan to get us out of Vietnam is what it was.
Correct. But he doubled down, and he was bombing. And, of course, the media was a firestorm. So Bill went in, and he knew, Richard Nixon, that he was going to be blasted by Walter Cronkite and David Reynolds and all the different there was only 3 networks back then. So Bill went in, and Nixon just freaked out, and he never got to talk to him about the issues that he went in to talk to him about. So Nixon had this paranoia, and he was going to win the election, and he was heavily favored in 1972. But as we all know, the plumbers, as we know, and the individuals that went in for the break-in to get the documents. So this began this whole process, and of course Woodward and Bernstein and uncovering and journalism that took on a whole new meaning in our life, which is good, right? Investigative journalism. That was the birth of investigative journalism in America. So when they were going through this process, the United States Congress had appointed Archibald Cox, who was a special prosecutor to investigate the Watergate mess. Archibald Cox was finding more and more and more information that was getting closer and closer and closer to the president. As a matter of fact, there was a lot, not only dotted lines, but significant straight lines right to the president with his team in Watergate. So this all came down in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, when Richard Nixon, it was in October, and I'll never forget this day because I actually was playing CYO, Catholic Youth Organization football, and I came back, and I was standing, and I came in home, and my dad was on the line with my uncle, and he told me to pick up the other line. That's the party line back in the day, so I could listen to my uncle talk about what happened. So I heard him tell my father exactly what happened, is that that Nixon had sent over as his emissary Robert Bork, who was one of the counsels within the Nixon administration. And this was the Saturday night in October in 1973 with specific instructions for Elliot Richardson, U.S. Attorney General, to fire Archibald Cox. Well, Elliot Richardson had agreed with my uncle. They had a meeting prior to them coming over, Elliot Richardson and my uncle. They had gamed this out. They knew what was coming. They knew what the orders were coming. And Elliot Richardson refused. Therefore, Robert Bork, through the president, immediately had the instructions to fire Elliot Richardson, which then elevated my uncle to be U.S. Attorney General for about 10 minutes. My uncle, knowing in advance what was happening, had already typed up a letter of resignation. So when Archibald Cox asked him to fire Robert Bork to fire Archibald Cox, then my uncle slid across the table his resignation. Hence the Saturday Night Massacre, where they were both wiped out.
Now, it seems to me, like I said, we always look at history through our own lenses, but just trying to put myself in the mindset of that time. In what universe does anybody think that this will work? I mean, was Nixon just a man of like, hey, these people would be loyal to me, they're true patriots, so therefore they'll do whatever I say without any question, or are these people, I don't know, kind of got integrity?
Well, and let's take that reverse almost, then I'll come back to that, Abdul, is that actually, so my aunt, Jill Rucklehouse, Bill, she didn't know this was happening. So on a Saturday afternoon, my uncle came back and said, oh, I just quit today, and I have 5 children at home, by the way, in Washington, D.C., with those costs. So Bill was, we still have these principled people in America today, right? We're still yearning. We just lost Jim Morris, for example. We need more uniters and less dividers. And that's what Bill Rucklehouse was. And Jim Morris was too. All in that, Dick Lugar was that. All in that same vein. And these were people that put country before self and put their ideology at the back seat. Really what was best for the country. And America has always had individuals stand up like this in specific times. So do we need more of those today? Yes. But we did have them back then.
John Ruckelshaus with us on the program today. John, the state senator here in Annapolis, Marion County. But his uncle was Bill Ruckelshaus, who was one of the U.S. attorneys and special prosecutors in the Watergate scandal 50 years ago this month that Richard Nixon ended up actually stepping down from office. Obviously, at the time, Bill probably could. There were a lot of things your uncle couldn't necessarily talk about. Was there anything in that whole Watergate process that he talked about later on that just like, wow, I had no idea?
Not really. I think, again, he and Elliot Richardson had gamed everything out. Bill knew that the one thing that he did know, Bill Ruckelshaus did, before anybody else did, he knew who Deep Throat was. If you remember your history, Deep Throat was the informant in the government that tipped off Woodward and Bernstein early that gave them the break, right? They would meet in the garage, if you remember the famous All the President's Men, both the book and the movie, which is still a great book and a movie. But he knew who Deep Throat was, and Bill kept that secret really to just 2 or 3 years before he passed away, right before it was announced, as a matter of fact. So he knew a lot of those players that were involved in that, but Bill was a very principled man and kept a lot of those things close to the vest.
And it's also interesting, too, like I said, just looking at the whole Watergate thing, that once again, what's going through the mind of people like, H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, G. Gordon Liddy, E. Howard Hunt, like what is going through these people's minds?
Abdul, I think you hit the nail on the head, is that these are individuals that, at least from a historical context that we can now look back on, is that, yes, they were deeply loyal to the man, Richard Nixon, and they would do anything that they could to protect the Nixon administration, the Nixon presidency. One of the things and I've served in an administration, one of the things that you understand when you go in and you're a subordinate, an agency head, or part of the governor's staff, is that if anything happens, it's the governor or it's the president or whoever's going to win. You're going to lose. So if you need to go, you need to go. If anybody's going to fall on the sword, it's going to be you. That's kind of inherent within any organization. And I think these guys just took it to a different level.
Yes. yes, they did on a number of different occasions. Now, obviously, there's been lots of books, lots of documentaries. Like I said, I'm a big fan of the HBO Max series of Plumbers. Looking at the Watergate perspective, obviously it's exaggerated for entertainment purposes from the perspective of G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt. And the one thing that I always want to know was true was, did E. Howard Hunt or did the Watergate plumbers leave a copy of the letter at the Watergate Hotel that ended up being in evidence? And Bob Woodward calls like, "Hey, let's speak to E. Howard Hunt. Mr. Hunt, why was your letter found at the Watergate Hotel? Why is it up at the police station? Was any of that true, or is it just made up?" Or
I think that was made up, and I probably can't address it deeply because Bill would have known, and Bill passed away sadly in 2019. But we talked all the time. When I was in the state Senate, Bill and I would talk every week, and he would tell me all these stories about the Nixon administration, the Reagan administration, and all the things that he had done. But now I think a lot of that, it's good for movies, good for theater.
And by the way, G. Gordon Liddy had a very sad Nazi German fetish thing. Like, dude, what is wrong with you? Like, didn't people just die like 30 years ago to stop these bastards from taking over the world? Whatever. Our guest.
So Abdul, I was going to tell you, you're a radio personality. If you remember, G. Gordon Liddy had a radio show, and he had the greatest catch line at the beginning: "Do time with Liddy."
Yep, exactly. Our guest on the program today, John Ruckelshaus. John, Republican state senator here in Indianapolis, Marion, Hamilton County, but also the nephew of Bill Ruckelshaus. Bill was U.S. attorney and actually a connection to the Watergate investigation, incident, resignation back in 1974. So we're sort of marking this like 50 years ago on the program today. Let's talk about the Watergate hearings. Your uncle have any thoughts on the Watergate hearings? And was it at the time just what we call must-see TV?
It was must-see TV. And think about this. That really was the beginning. Again, Woodward and Bernstein, the beginning of investigative journalism in America, and really elevated that profession to what it is today. And we need more journalists, right? We need even the fourth estate. I think it's very critical to watch over government. And really they were in their explosion because a lot of college students started their careers based upon that, right? So that was the first time that we did have those televised hearings. We had had them before, if you remember, in the Kennedy administration, Robert Kennedy, when he had the investigation about mafia. That was a little bit of that, but television wasn't in full medium at that point. This captured the nation's fancy. And it was really John Dean, who was the one who was the chief legal counsel for the president, that sort of spilled the beans and really opened the door during all those congressional investigations and all those congressional hearings. And it was very bipartisan. These were not just, if you look back on some of the January 6th investigation, of course, you need to have investigations like that, but it seemed to be more one-sided, more partisan. This was a very bipartisan congressional hearing at that time period.
What was your uncle's thoughts on the whole hearings?
He didn't think that, when I say he didn't think that much about it, he didn't talk that much about it because he was so engrossed in doing his job as assistant attorney general. He didn't really, I wouldn't say that he wasn't a fan of John Dean. I think that was the one piece that I look back on it that I wish I'd have spent more time talking to Bill about what his thought process was of John Dean. Because John Dean, again, was a central figure in all of this. So I don't, as I remember looking back at it, I don't think he was necessarily a fan, but I think that was the important part.
So we go to the Watergate hearings. The Congress is actually going to return articles of impeachment against the president. The president decides, at midnight tonight I will step down as president of the United States. Gerald Ford will take over. What was that like for you guys?
It was really an interesting period because for America, frankly, because when was the last time that we had anything like that? Of course, in our history, we've had situations similar to, but this was a time of national chaos, if you will. Again, the Vietnam War was going on. There was unrest in the campuses. The economy was one of the main issues. And this was a time that America needed healing, and they needed trust in government. And I think this actually sort of, if you look back on it, this kind of catapulted this national consciousness that we have today of distrust of government, correct? And we all need to get back that you got to trust somebody at some point, correct? Now, the people that we put in, that's why we have elections, and that's why we need to pay attention to that. But it was a really interesting time because America and all of us felt that we were starving for leadership at that point. And Gerald Ford stepped in, a very calm man from Michigan, former football player. And one of the first things that he did is that he pardoned Richard Nixon, which historically was the exact right thing to do. The nation needed to heal. But he paid the ultimate price at the ballot box 2 years later.
What did your uncle do after Watergate now and Gerald Ford's president? What did he do afterwards?
So he then stayed in the Washington, D.C. area. As I mentioned before, he went home that Saturday afternoon, looked at his wife. He has 5 young children. Hey, I'm out of a job. So he had to start from scratch, and he started a law firm with 2 other, Beveridge and Diamond. It's the name of the law firm that's still there in Washington, D.C. today. So he stayed there for a few years. And then one of his classmates, his roommates at Princeton, was one of the Weyerhaeuser boys. So he then went out to Seattle, Washington, and took a job as chief legal counsel for Weyerhaeuser, the timber company. So that's how he and his family didn't come back to Indianapolis. They moved to Seattle, Washington, one of your favorite places, which is a beautiful city. We've been out there multiple times. And he lived out there for many years. And then knocking at the door, of course, became the Reagan administration, the woman that they had chosen to be their first EPA director, for whatever reason, flamed out. So Bill went back and did one more stint in government and second tour of duty as the Environmental Protection Agency chief in the Reagan administration.
Was he before James Watt?
Yes.
Yeah, that
guy. Yes.
He was a character.
Now, an interesting footnote, this was really interesting, is that in 1976, Bill was the finalist for Gerald Ford to be his vice presidential nominee. So I remember we had done all the interviews at our house, my dad did, and I remember in the living room, all the national media was there and interviewing my dad for background information. Bill was selected. This was on a Wednesday. They were going to announce it Thursday morning, and then, of course, the speeches. And we were ready to travel to Kansas City. But then at the last minute, the Reagan forces, who had lost in the primary, put influence on Gerald Ford to put Bob Dole in. So my uncle was on the cutting room floor right at the last second. Otherwise, he would have been Gerald Ford's vice presidential nominee in 1976. So we did that. That was another flash.
Indiana has this thing for vice presidents for some strange
we
reason.
We do. We grow more than corn in Indiana, right, Abdul?
Yes, we do. Well, almost out of time. We've got a couple minutes left here. So after all that, what did Uncle Bill do?
So then he became, as I mentioned, chairman of the board at Browning Ferris Incorporated for about 5 years, lived in Houston, and then went back to Seattle. He then joined a venture capital firm with some folks. His last bit of service, if you will, is something that he was very proud of. He was nominated by President Clinton to be the salmon man. So in the Northwest, as you know, that's one of the major issues is the trade relationship between Canada and the United States on salmon. So Bill, again, is a uniter, not a divider, which we need more of today. And that's what he did. He worked very hard on making sure in the environment, and he also started the Bill Ruckelshaus Institute at the University of Washington.
So as we close up here, my friend, what would you say would be the what if you're a young person or an elected official, what can you learn from your Uncle Bill's time and tenure doing the whole before, pre, during, and post Watergate?
I would say, and at the risk of repeating myself, his greatest legacy is being a uniter and not a divider. And that was the one thing that I learned, we've all learned, and that's what he did at the Bill Ruckelshaus Center. That's what the whole emphasis of that was, to bring complex problems, factions that have been warring or had been in adverse situations for years and years. Where can we find common ground? He's a solution-oriented guy, and that's what we need today.
All right. Well, oh, by the way, anything coming up with the legislature? Property taxes, health care, or we can talk about all that.
That's right.
At another time. Our guest on the program today has been our good friend, John Ruckelshaus, state senator here in Indianapolis, representing Indianapolis and also portions of the southern portion of southern parts of Hamilton County. So, John, my friend, as always, sir, thank you very much for being with us. Always great to talk to you, and we'll definitely, like I said, appreciate everything that you and your family done with respect to public service, and we'll definitely be chatting once the legislature comes in with a new governor and new legislative agenda.
Can't wait.